are once again holding our symposium virtually. So this allows us to reach more people and more places. This webinar session features research from different students in different fields. During their presentations, all mics will be muted. So please type your questions for them in the chat box, and the researchers will answer them during the Q&A session after they're done with their presentations. Thank you so much for coming. Our first presenter is Isabelle Killian. She is from the Department of Modern and Classical Languages, and her presentation is titled The COVID-19 Epidemic in France, May 11, 2020, November 21st, 2020. Isabelle, when you are ready to bring up your slides, you may begin.
All right, Dr. Acosta. Share now. Okay. Okay. Can you see my slide, my first slide? Okay, you can. Perfect. Thank you. Well, hello everyone. Bonjour. My name is Isabelle Killian, and yes, I will be talking to you today about the research I did in my class French 3170, taught by Dr. Nikolova. And the topic is l'épidémie de Covid-19 en France, mai 2020 à novembre 21, 2020, which in English is the COVID-19 epidemic in France from May 11th to November 21st. So this is me, and I guess it went back out. So this is me studying French at Valdosta State University, thoroughly enjoying my time with you guys, wonderful teachers, in particular Dr. Nikolova, who I will never forget, is going to remain a very important part of my time at VSU. So thank you, Dr. Nikolova. All right, so let's start with an introduction about the topic. The world, and in particular Europe, is fighting COVID-19, as you all know. In France, the alarming rise of infection cases and the great number of deaths had forced the French government to place the country under a very strict lockdown last year, which ended on May 11th, after the number of infections dropped sharply, as shown by the first blue arrow on this graph. The study focuses on the post-lockdown period from May 11th to November 21st. November 21st was the end of my semester. So I will focus on three main points: the governmental measures post-lockdown and the start of a second lockdown, then the reactions of the French people, positive or negative, and the weariness, finally, and the loosening of some French citizens, as well as the dangers accompanied by this. Number one, the easing of lockdown measures. As you can see on this photo, the process of reopening France was spread out over 4 phases, each of them loosening a little bit more the measures that had been in effect during the first lockdown. But as the country was gradually going back to our normal life, the number of coronavirus infections rose, and it finally led on October 30th to a second lockdown. Let's start with May 11th. Edouard Philippe, France's Prime Minister, announced on May 7th that the strict lockdown would end on May 11th, and France would begin to ease its strict coronavirus restrictions, of course varying with each region's rate of infection. I don't know if you can see, but there is a little map that shows how France was at that time. Most of France was green, so almost infection-free. and a small portion was in red. It was still quite infected, and it would have to remain under lockdown for now. Phase 1. The first lift of restrictions are the following. Some schools reopen. Masks are mandatory for staff and teachers. Stores reopen. French citizens can travel inside the country within a 100-kilometer perimeter. A written notification, though, is needed for longer distances. Some regions, still too contaminated, stay under lockdown. Phase 2, other openings. All schools now can reopen. Offices reopen and workers stop working from home. Bars and restaurants reopen, with tables spaced at least 1 meter apart. Paris, on the other hand, is still too infected, so it's only allowing their customers to sit outdoors. Small gatherings are allowed. Phase 3, third wave of reopenings. Cinemas, vacation centers, and casinos. Of course, always having to respect social distanciations and wearing masks. The last phase is July 11th. Beaches reopen, but people cannot lay down on the beach. They have to stand up, which looks a little silly and is a little bit exhausting under the heat. They have to either walk or just stand. The gyms can reopen, and masks are now mandatory in closed spaces. Around September 11th, unfortunately, the epidemic is growing again. We reached 400,000 COVID-19 cases at that time, with 35,000 deaths as of September 11th. So from white to red, France is becoming, from green to red, it's becoming a little bit green, but a lot orange, which means it's quite infected. The following month, in October, France reaches a new record with infections peaking at 41,000 cases in 24 hours. So half of France has now high numbers of COVID-19 infections. They're in red on the map. The government at that time imposes a night curfew on these regions, and those not respecting the curfew risk a fine of 135 euros. On October 28th, in a televised address, Emmanuel Macron, the French president, announces a 4-week reconfinement of the French population starting on October 30th. He really had tried to take gradual measures not to have to reach that point, but he's just faced with reality. French people will just not get better if they're not stopped from going out. The measures, though, are less rigid than during the spring lockdown, where people could not even leave their house for more than 1 hour per day. So in this lockdown, you can go to work. It is still possible to visit people in retirement homes. Most schools stay open. The supermarkets and pharmacies stay open because they're considered essential businesses. However, establishments that are not considered essentials, like the bookstores, the bars, and the restaurants, must close. Restaurants can offer delivery and takeout orders, but it does not represent a big revenue for them. On November 2nd, people cannot leave home without a valid permission to be out in public. During the first lockdown, it was a paper version. This time it's with an app. Masks are mandatory for even younger children. Negative reactions of French citizens. Teachers are really upset because they cannot actually respect the health protocol. The distanciation is not possible. Teachers are sick. Kids are, crammed into smaller classes. They're asking to have freedom to adapt the protocol according to the size of their class. Another group really upset are obviously restaurant owners who are really upset that a study by the Institute Pasteur said that going to a bar or a restaurant can really increase contamination. And they really debate the results of these findings. And even though the government is giving them a lot of financial help, they lament that their income is wiped out. And then, as we mentioned earlier, yes, supermarkets can stay open, but not small stores like, for example, bookstores. And you know, some big brand supermarkets have decided to show solidarity and to close their books departments. And of course, as you can imagine, the hospital workers denounce the unacceptable conditions of their work. They don't have enough resources. They've got to work quite often an extra 40 hours a week of overtime. They cannot take their days off, even as their vacation time. There are not enough beds, soap, masks. They feel exhausted and in danger. And there's such an amount of resignations that even though the hospitals hire more people, it's actually not more people, it's just to replace those who left. Now, the positive reactions of some of the French people. President Macron and his government have empowered local authorities like the mayors, who you can see on this photo, to implement recommendations specific to their local situation. And that was really good. We want to note that 50% of French mayors are worried, though, of economic consequences because of this new lockdown. Then we also have the seniors who are so worried to catch the virus from a family member that the idea of a lockdown is actually making them feel much better. You can see there's 70% of them really worried about their health. And finally, in France, employment of both parents is very high. So the priority is to reopen schools. Many teleworkers have felt the need to find a place also with one more room to make it a home office, because as you can see on this photo, the situation of working with young children from home is just not doable sometimes. Last part, the loosening and weariness of French citizens. Oh, I went too fast, I'm sorry. By the end of October 2020, in Paris, one person is getting infected every 30 seconds, and one Parisian is admitted to the hospital with the disease every 15 minutes, according to the health minister. The police have observed clandestine parties, private dinners. Some Parisians are still hosting illicit parties, and some parents are organizing children's play dates. So that is one of the main reasons why cases are going up. And that's why the president had decided on a somewhat strict lockdown. Conclusion. During this COVID crisis, some sectors of the economy emerged as winners while others got hurt. Stuck at home during each lockdown, French people spent more on home and garden items. Working and studying from home led to high sales of IT equipment. For the same reason, video game sales and subscriptions to Netflix increased sharply. E-commerce was another big winner, fueled in part by the fact that many traditional store brands started selling online. Yes, France is far behind the US in that domain. For example, before COVID, France's food industry was mostly a brick and mortar industry with absolutely no online presence. This field has grown considerably, especially among the elderly who see it as a real service. And my dad, who lives in France, that's how he gets most of his groceries delivered. The rest is when my family visits. So I'm really thankful for that. Now, on the other hand, the debt, that's on the negative side, right? The debt of the country rose to 113 billion euros. the economy fell 8.3%. The restaurant industry also lost 55% of its activity. And finally, the auto industry lost 26% of its revenue, because you can imagine that when you're not allowed to leave home, you really reconsider buying a new car. There is absolutely no need for that. At the end of 2020, President Macron said the recent news of successful vaccine trials offered a glimmer of hope, and that France would aim to begin vaccinations against COVID-19 at the end of December or the beginning of January, starting, of course, with the elderly and the most vulnerable. So this was how, during the second lockdown, people are starting to regain some hope. I will end by reading this statement from President Macron. He said, "We are at war. The enemy is there, invisible, elusive, advancing, and that requires our general mobilization." I personally hope that French citizens will take ownership of their safety, and that they will be moved by a sense of community and responsibility. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Isabelle. Please write questions for her in the chat box, and we will ask them at the end of the session. Our next presenter is Nicholas Flatt. He is from the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies. His presentation is titled "The Paradox of Authentic Faith." And you can begin your presentation whenever you're ready, Nick.
Nick, this is Dr. Lovren. Do you have your microphone muted? Well, everyone, it looks like we may have lost Nick at this point. Oh, he may be back. Let's give him a minute and then we'll see what we can do. Nick, are you back with us, and can you start your program? I tell you what, while we're waiting for Nick to get back in touch with us, Karen, why don't you go ahead and start the questions for Isabella, and we'll see what we can do with Nick's equipment.
Okay, great. So we have a few questions from the audience, and if you have any other questions, please type them in the chat box. The first question for you, Isabelle, is from Chastity Hamilton. She asks, with phases being approximately 3 weeks apart, were the hikes in cases gradual or sudden?
Well, the cases were kind of sudden towards the end of fall, but at the beginning, they were still very, very gradual. France stayed with very few cases for at least, I'm looking at my graph, 1, 2, 3, almost, let's say, 2.5 months after the first lockdown. And starting September, it started to rise, and in October, it was peaking very sharply, suddenly.
Thank you. We have another question from Dr. Lovern. She asked, how would you compare the French public and the American public in their reactions?
Well, throughout my research, of course, I was constantly comparing reactions. Um, I work in I work in a commercial in a mall, right? And the way some of my customers fight the mask mandate in Florida resembles the kind of arrogance that some of the French people have shown during either not the lockdowns, because you were just stuck at home, otherwise you were getting a fine, but when it started to be left upon you to take responsibility for protecting others, then we saw quite a bit of French people deciding that they didn't care and that they were debating the even the COVID-19 itself and all these medical findings about how it is carried from one person to another. So I think that there is quite a lot of resemblance, yes, in the reactions.
That's very interesting. That is so similar.
Mm-hmm.
I have another question for you from Chastity Hamilton. She says, hearing of the permission slip, in quotes, to be outside reminds me of some not so great periods in history. Was this one of the concerns voiced by French citizens?
No, no. It was simply that they thought it was really annoying. For example, during the first lockdown, imagine old people like my dad who live without a printer. They could not go online, find on the government website the form, print it, fill it out, and go. So it was extremely inconvenient. Thank God the newspapers thought of this, and in the daily newspapers you could cut out a page which was the permission slip. So people were just annoyed of the inconvenience. The second lockdown, which is part of my research, was much easier because an app had been developed by then. So it was still annoying, but it was just that. It was just annoying.
I have a question. This is from me. How did you decide what aspects of the pandemic you wanted to focus on for your research? It's such a big topic.
It is, isn't it? What happened is that I had two courses with Dr. Nikolova. And as we were discussing, her family is from Europe also. And as we were discussing our different families' lives during the first lockdown, uh, we decided that the first research I would do would be to interview on video anybody I knew in France during the first lockdown. So that was my first piece of work. Once the second class started, it seemed a good continuation to, as it was a free topic, to choose the topic of the after lockdown. And that is why I chose that one part. And why did I end my study on November 21st? It's because it was simply that I was following really live almost what was happening in France. And November 22nd was when it was the end of my semester with Dr. Nikolova, and I had to just give back my dissertation. So that's when I stopped.
So the ending was arbitrary, but it
Yeah,
really did compile quite a period, the most active period.
absolutely. And what's amazing is that our first title of my study was The Reopening of France. And as the month went by, we had to change the title to The Reopening of France and the Second Lockdown. I didn't know it was going to go into another lockdown, so that was not part of what it was supposed to be at first.
Isabelle, that's a second paper.
Yes, yes.
Okay, we have a couple more questions. Lovern says, is there anything that surprised you about your research?
Anything that surprised me? Yes, it's not necessarily my research, but while I was doing my research, I was asking my family and friends to send me as much information as possible of what they were living. And what I received the most were memes done by French people of kind of doing, you know, mocking themselves uh, on what they were going through and how they had to cope. So I really don't think in the USA there were that many fun memes about any lockdowns, because we never got to that, and then of course of reopenings. But because of what Europe went through, I know that in Italy it was also quite a bit of that. French people showed their sense of humor in doing extraordinary memes and hilarious videos where people would, for example, do sports inside their house, but in a fun way. And people would pretend to go out to a bar, but they would actually put makeup on in front of their mirror, say, okay, I'll meet you in just a second in the kitchen. And that's all they could do. They could go have a drink in their kitchen. That was their outing of the day. So I just was surprised by the amount of humor that French people used to cope.
Thank you, Isabel. We do have a couple more questions for you, but it seems that we have gotten our second presenter back. And so we'll move to him and then continue with the questions after he is done presenting. So Nick, we have you back with your presentation on the paradox of authentic faith. And if you are ready, you can begin your slides.
Well, this is indeed odd. We are having trouble getting his microphone and his phone to call in and work. So we may have to move Nick to a later time today to see if we can get all of the equipment working. So Dr. Costa, if you want to finish with the last questions, we'll go ahead. And Nick, if you can hear me, we're going to talk to you and move you to later time. We'll let everybody know when his time is for those who came here to see him. All right? Thank you.
Yes, thank you everyone for sticking with us through the technical issues. Isabel, we do have a couple more questions for you before we wrap up. One of them is from Dr. Nikolova. She says, could you tell us more about the positive reactions of French people? For example, how they celebrated the work of health workers.
Absolutely. um, just like in Italy, during the first lockdown, people would open their windows since they were not allowed to go outside. And every night at 8 p.m., complete cities would applaud for a minute. And they would applaud the heroes that were the healthcare workers. They would also bring cakes, and things to eat to hospitals, and they were putting signs everywhere, "You are our heroes." However, healthcare workers were really touched by this, but during the first lockdown, they were convinced that this would lead to an increase in pay, to more means, to work in better condition. So healthcare workers were extremely disappointed and angry when they saw that post-lockdown there was very little change, and that when they heard that there was going to be another lockdown, and they saw that towards the end of the fall, infections were rising. They got even more scared, and many of them said, applauds are really nice, cake is really good, but that is not paying my bills. We need more manpower, and we need more money. The problem in France is that healthcare workers are denouncing that public hospitals are now functioning more as private industries, trying to cut down costs to maximize benefits. And as I mentioned earlier, they don't even have enough soap sometimes. So a lot of them actually quit and go work in same type of hospitals, but the private hospitals. So yes, they were celebrated, but the healthcare workers wish the government has celebrated them with more money.
Thank you, Isabelle. There is one more question for you from Dr. Knowles, and he says, where does this research lead to? Does it suggest other research questions?
Well, of course, there is so much that this could lead to. As you mentioned, this could lead to a more in-depth research of how people in different countries show unification or not during crisis. Or French people who are worldly known to be quite egocentrical, are they will they have learned from this experience, and will they later on change their way of acting, whether it be in public or in their decisions? Will they actually be at the bottom of the list compared to how Germans react, and maybe Italians? There could be a huge amount of topics studied. Of course, aside from the health topics, but I think the psychology behind the reactions of each countries during this crisis would be a very interesting topic of research.
Thank you so much. That was very interesting. Both the topic and your presentation were fascinating.